Well, we'll start real quickly by introducing ourselves and telling you a little about how we came to this work and what we do. Does that sound good?
Awesome. We didn't prepare, but
we did.
Yeah,
we prepared. All right, I'll go. So I have been in the education space now just for about 2.5, 3 years. Not very long. Does not make me an expert. Before that, I was the co-founder and CTO of a company called Yammer, which is how I got in the whole future of work world, and the whole responsive thing started all through that. I think that the important part that relates the two is that we began, when I was at Yammer, our mission was really to help make companies more empowered and transparent, and to help change these companies. And we thought initially we would do that by giving them a tool that would enable them to work in more responsive ways. What we learned very quickly was that while that was a component of it, the harder part was shifting the mindsets of the people that worked at these companies so that they even understood what that looked like or why it mattered. And even if they wanted to change, if we couldn't shift their mental models and mindsets of what an organization could work like, then it just didn't work. And so suddenly we became in the business of shifting mindsets, and that was really what we did. I left in 2012 after having worked with huge companies all around the world, really learning about that, and decided to tackle a much easier problem in education. And but actually, one of the real reasons I ended up in education, which I think is relevant, is that I found it very difficult to change adult mindsets. It turned out that is a very hard problem. Present company excluded, it's very hard to change adult mindsets. And given that we have lots of big problems in the world to deal with, I thought, all right, I'll just give up on the adults. We'll just go to the kids, because then their minds aren't set yet. We should be able to give them, be able to empower them and teach them and all that. The fatal flaw, of course, was that you have to get through the adults to get to the kids. So it's sort of back where I left off. So maybe you go first, and then we'll do what we do real quick. And then,
all right. Isn't there a movie about like someone going back to the kids and changing their mindsets to change the future?
Do you mean Back to the Future?
No. So my background also comes from outside of education initially. I'm an architect by practice. Well, just to step back, I'm a byproduct of a tiger mom, and as a result, like education was shoved down my throat, and the importance of it was shoved down my throat. So I ended up going to I grew up in San Francisco. I ended up going to the college as far as possible from San Francisco, Cornell, and studied as an architect, then as a trader, and then I was in the concert business, and through that I ended up in education somehow. When I started in education, I got to know college presidents really well, and I thought, wow, these problems seem so simple. So obviously no one's thought of the answer, so I'm going to go in and try to solve these problems. And 20 years later, I've been in education for 20 years. I'm still trying to solve the same problems that I was trying to deal with back then. So now I just plug my book. I wrote this book. It's going to become a Netflix original pretty soon. But it came out in February, and what we tried to do was my co-author, some of you might know her, Alexis Gonzalez-Black. She's been involved with responsive work for a little bit as well. What we decided was there are some practices in corporations that could be applied in education, and we try to take these 6 practices and bring them into education.
And what does Ed Elements do, real quick?
Yeah, so Ed Elements, we're a consulting firm that works with school districts across the country, about 40, 50 school districts, 600 schools, where we help them rethink school models, instructional design, professional development, and leadership.
So, and my company, Able, how I came to that real quick was, again, knowing nothing about education when I began to research the field, like everybody, and we're going to talk about this in a second, I thought I understood what school was because I had been in a school. I mean, later I learned that that was like saying you know how to run an airline because you've flown on a plane kind of thing. And I spent, you thought that was funny. I spent a year researching, and what I discovered is that there are a lot of very good ideas out there already. There's a lot of ideas for how to reinvent education, but a lot of those ideas get stuck when they go to get implemented. And there's a lot of systems in place that are not in the classroom, that are really sort of at the school and district level, that conspire to keep things the way they are. And so Able is a technology platform and a consultancy itself that is helping schools figure out how to rethink time and resources through this complex process they go through in ways that enable them to iterate more rapidly, get more data, iterate more rapidly. Our users are principals and superintendents, not students or teachers. We impact the classroom by changing the structures around it.
Yep. So you mentioned we all went to school, like hands raised, everybody went to some school? Yeah,
Some of the audience.
How many of you have kids in schools? All right. So one of the things that we found is that just because we went to school, just because we have kids in school, means that we understand school. And in many ways, we have a sense of how we should experience school, but we don't understand the inner workings. And so what we're here to talk about is actually school systems, right? Education systems versus the process of learning. And this isn't a discussion of responsive learning, it's really a discussion around the organization around education that exists and things that we've noticed that need to change in order for the kinds of changes we all want to take place.
So we thought we'd start by talking a little bit about how schools and school systems are actually similar to companies, because a lot of people, I think, assume that it must be very different. But both of us coming from outside education in find it to be surprisingly similar. For example, schools are large people systems. They have organizational structures, they deal with budgets, they deal with divisions, they have division chairs and heads, they really, in a lot of ways, actually function and look like companies. They have to figure out how they're going to do their status meetings and how they're going to do roll-ups, and they decide on metrics that they're going to work towards, as examples.
Yeah, the other thing we have to think about is, if you look at across the country, there are schools in very rural areas where they're the largest employer, and there are schools in urban areas like Miami-Dade where they're the largest employer, right? So school systems are, in fact, like some of the largest employers in the country. We have about 5 million educators in the United States. We don't think about it that way, but trying to mobilize 5 million people in one direction is really hard. The other thing is they're also constrained by time in many ways. So a school has to open at a certain time and close at a certain time. And there are certain days that you have to be there. And so there's some constraints similar to a retail store where we expect people to show up at a certain time, leave at a certain time because there are set expectations. And it's really hard to create opportunities for the teachers or the staff people to develop themselves in those kinds of environments where there are very strict constraints.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that seems very familiar is that a lot of us, many of us here are trying to bring more responsive practices into the companies we work for, or maybe you consult with companies. And sometimes it can be hard to understand, well, I've just told you a better way to do it, why don't you just do it this way? But there are these structures and systems in place that make it hard for them to understand how. Schools are very similar in that, for example, one thing we talked about earlier is onboarding becomes incredibly important, just like in any company. And yet schools are incredibly hard. They have a difficult time onboarding because they just don't have the time to do it. When would that happen in a way that there's sufficient support to onboard teachers or other employees, as an example? Another similarity is that in school systems, the people who get promoted into successive roles may not know how to do the role they were promoted into. This is very common among companies, I'm sure. Yeah, really. There was the, I know. And because, oftentimes, for example, the principal is someone who was a former educator, but being a principal is not being an educator. It is dealing with finance, budget, HR, PR, parents. Yeah, there's almost nothing to do with being an educator. And so, the expectations we have about, for example, a principal or something to be able to do their job well comes from a lack of understanding of what the job really is.
Right.
Go on.
Okay.
Okay, so what we wanted to do, so all that is to say that as much as we like to think about how we want to radically change school, it is important to understand that school exists with its structures for a reason. That it was designed to scale to every student, which was a unique thing at the time. It was happening 150 years ago or whatever. And while I agree we want the whole thing to change, that requires more than just saying let's change the curriculum or let's yell at teachers to do better or something. Because I feel like that's oftentimes what we do. The systems and structures reinforce the way it is, and if we want to change it, we have to rethink how those systems work and rethink the mindsets within schools.
Yeah, and also I think just to reinforce, we have a very traditional notion of scale. Our traditional notion has been, once we figure out something, we're going to do it over and over again across everybody. And that's kind of standardization. And in kind of the modern world, that's not how we think, right? We actually want to implement technology in order to create customization or personalization. And so the goal of scale is to personalize across large sets of people in the ways that they need, and that's the kind of experience that we want to have. Yet the mentality that we're dealing with and the way government and school systems have been structured is that no, like actually we want to create the same system and do it over and over again across 55 million students.
And it started with very good intentions. Probably the most important lesson I learned when I was researching schools by talking to school leaders. I mean, by far the thing that surprised me the most was when I started researching school, I began to hear people who were telling a similar story that we tell in the responsive world. They were saying, the way we run schools hasn't changed in 150 years since it was designed for the Industrial Revolution, and it's one size fits all, and we have to change it. That's the story that we're told. But when you talk to school leaders, that is not what they understand to be true at all. That is completely false. What they know is that school has changed radically in the last 40 or 50 years. It's just still not serving kids well. I'm not saying that was an improvement, but what actually happened was 40 or 50 years ago, back when maybe school was more one size fits all, there was a recognition that if we're going to educate everybody, which we want to do, then we might have to give special resources and special help to certain people. And so they began to create special designations, policy, budgets, line items, resources based on these designations. So they would say, well, you have a learning disability, and so we have this new law, IDEA, we're going to give you what's called an IEP, Individualized Education Plan, you're going to be labeled special ed, and that means you get these resources. And the intent was like personalization, and the intent was, let's figure out how to give the right resources. The challenge, to your point about standardization, is it's not like a student is a special ed student and they're going to die that way. What's really happens in schools is that a student, first of all, may have 12 labels. They might have English language learner with an RTI level and have an IEP, and you don't need to know what any of these acronyms are. And yet the system looks at each of those labels differently, and it says, okay, well, let's look at our English language learners and do this with them. Let's look at our students who have this IEP and do this with them. Well, those are the same students, but it can't see that because the systems that are put in place conspire to sort of not look at the whole child, but instead look through the lens of these labels which come with resources. And through that lens, all change becomes very difficult because you have to figure out how a new idea, personalization or whatever, fits into the mold of all of these classic labels and systems. When the real answer is to sort of strip those things away.
Well, imagine if you were in a meeting like this with 30 people and we were trying to explain something to you, and we noticed that this group didn't get it. We were like, oh, we're just going to pull you out and stick you over here until you get it. And that's what happens in classrooms today. It's just like, if you don't get it, we're just going to pull you out, send you over here until you get it, and I'm going to continue working with this group because we're the guys that are like at level.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the whole system of education at the moment in this country looks through the lens of big labels and big buckets. You're a third or fourth grader. You have an IEP or you're normal. Or you're, and there's no gradations, and it doesn't even know how to consider them together. It's just like you're one of those things, and you're behind here, you're held back a year, you're here, and it's not. Those things were designed with good intentions, but to unwind those things is incredibly complex. And I think this gets to the next part we wanted to get into. So we have sort of two topics that are very specific in our mind to how education relates or not to companies. And we're going to be a little interactive, and we're going to ask you to talk to each other at some point. So just get used to that idea now. You can't move, too, so whoever you're sitting next to, just get used to it.
keeps on looking at my notes. I'm just crossing them off so you can't see them.
Do you want to introduce the topics?
Yes. So the first one is purpose over structure. We all talk about purpose as an organization and the need for purpose, but in education, there is a clear purpose, and so we're going to debate that a little bit. And then the second topic is around what are the things that we do every day within our organizations that create the behaviors around the mindsets that we have. And are they for the mindsets that we want to create, or are they actually a deterrent against the mindsets?
So in the future of work circles that we are all here inhabiting, there's often a tension between the people who sort of the human purpose lens come at it from that versus people who come at it from the structure side. This has been my experience. And on one side you have the teal folks, and the other side you have the beige folks, or I don't know. But and it's kind of frustrating too, because oftentimes each side sort of says, well, this is all you need. And I think coming in education, we both found that here's a system where we have purpose. Everyone in the building knows we're there for the kids, and people often talk about schools as if they don't care about the kids because look what's happening. It's not true. I mean, principals, teachers, they really do care. They have shared purpose. And you know what? It is insufficient. It is insufficient for what they're trying to accomplish.
Are you looking to me to talk? Oh, okay. So, yeah, I mean, we agree. So when we work with school districts and schools, one of the things that we find is that everyone started in education because they want to make a difference. It's absolutely clear that teachers are, and no one wants to work those crummy hours unless they really care about wanting to make a difference. And so you're in education with a clear purpose. What doesn't exist are the structures that help you achieve those goals. And a perfect example of this is every district in the country, school in the country, has a strategic plan. And every strategic plan has one statement in it: improve student outcomes. And yet, we have yet to achieve that goal, right? And that's true for decades, for multiple decades across a lot of schools. Another goal people have is hire and recruit the best teachers. Well, we have a set number of teachers, and so people are robbing teachers from each other. We're not going to be able to replace all of the teachers in the world or in the country. And so when we think about, one, everybody's working really hard. Two, we can't replace everybody. The only lever we have is how we work. And so the structures are kind of the rules in which how an organization works. And that's why it's so critical to have those in place.
What is the purpose of purpose, Anthony?
I think you said it better, but it had something to do with, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the purpose of purpose is to create alignment and to accelerate decision making, because we don't always know what to do when we're collaborating, and ideally with purpose, it helps us make decisions when it's unclear what to do. However, purpose is insufficient because we all might disagree on how to interpret the purpose, how to execute on the purpose. Schools are such classic examples of this because every teacher, they may really believe in that, but here's a real example. You're of a classroom, there's a couple students who are not performing well, but they're also misbehaving. And by doing so, they're making it hard for everyone else to learn. What should we do? Should we remove those students so that they're not learning, but now we can let the other people learn? Or should we help those students? Like, what is our purpose here? Is it to help every student? Is it to, what trade-offs do we need to make? And I think when we look at schools and you see the crazy trade-offs they have to make around, well, who are we helping here? Are we trying to raise everybody's scores? Are we just trying to help the top kids or the bottom kids? Or it becomes very confusing. And it's the structures that you put in place that create the rest of the coordination and create the rest of the mindsets so that you can agree on what to do. How are we executing? What purpose do we actually believe in?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to reinforce that, we work with the district Miami-Dade, and it's the fourth largest school district in the United States. About 350,000 students and about 50,000 teachers. So they're recruiting 3,000 to 5,000 teachers a year. How do you get them all aligned to do the work around the goal, which is like improve student outcomes, and everyone's interpretation of how student outcomes are produced is very different across 50,000 people. So I think that's the challenge that we have, and the communication structures that go from the superintendent's office to the middle managers to the instructional coaches to the principals to the teachers to the classroom to the parents are all kind of broken because they don't have a product like Yammer connecting them all.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the example I gave of equity. This is one we both see in schools all the time, where schools are complex sets of different types of students that have very different needs. And it's not possible, there isn't enough resources to give everybody as much resources as you can. And so you make these questionable trade-offs sometimes about, example would be, you have a whole bunch of really active parents that want to make sure students have a lot of choice in the courses that they can take, so that they can take Russian 5 and Band 4 or what, I don't know, whatever. And but as a result of that, you're starving resources from students that need opportunities for intervention or other things. And you have different constituencies here who, they all want to help the kids, they all just have different kids, and nobody wants to give up anything for the greater good. And so without having ways of reasoning about these things, often through like the clear purpose and having structure, you just end up getting in arguments on how do you define this or who are we helping, as an example.
Let's ask a question.
Okay, so we have a question that we're going to ask you to turn to each other and ask. And again, the context here is that oftentimes there's discussion about the importance of purpose. And I am a huge believer in purpose, that's why I have an education. But it is sometimes insufficient to help resolve conflicts, to help make decisions, to help create alignment. So the question is, you can turn to one or another person, and we'll ask a couple of people to report back, is, can you think of an instance where purpose either very much helped you resolve something or execute in a way you couldn't before, or where purpose was insufficient? You had purpose, but you still were unable to come to an agreement as to what to do. You have 3 minutes. Okay, we're going to bring it back to the middle. You guys sound like you're having engaging conversations. Anthony and I feel left out. All right.
Sorry.
We're going to give you the mic though.
Yeah.
We're going to flip the conference.
Who has, we'll take just a couple, who has a quick story about where purpose was sufficient or insufficient?
It's quick, but
Quick is great.
Yes, Jackie. Having worked in education, in urban education reform, to your question about purpose being insufficient, what I was saying to my partner here is that everybody comes to schools understanding that the purpose in general is to educate children. But because we live in a multicultural, multiracial democracy with people with social identities who come to that system, everybody is interpreting that, right? Like, what is the system going to do for me and my child? The purpose, what does it mean to educate my child who's Black male here?
Yeah.
Or my child who has a disability here? And so what I was sharing with him around these structures that humans create, right, with these unintended outcomes, is that there are actual explicit rules to the system, so those are easy to move and redesign. Yeah. But there are also implicit rules, just like there is in all of our organizations and companies, around what's happening under the surface, which is why we keep getting inequitable outcomes over and over and over again. So how do you solve for what you can see and what you can't see?
That's great. I mean, a classic example of that is the way equity is exposed is we have measures of success that we can maybe look at a school level, which then make it easy to just say, well, if you're like a charter school that can choose your population, we just won't admit students who will make our scores look low, and now we look good. So this is a great organization. They have metrics and they have purpose, but they're actually exposing the structural issues. That's right. That's a good one. Any other thoughts on that?
So I had the opportunity to serve on the San Jose Unified School District Board in San Jose for 4 years, and we were all aligned in terms of purpose. The statement, all students must learn, all students can achieve, we're all aligned with. But personally, I believe that if we are not seeing outcomes aligned to race justice, and I'm so glad you brought up the word race, then we are not doing right by our students. And so when the superintendent, a very bold visionary superintendent, said, I want to launch a Latino male initiative, because that was our most vulnerable student population in terms of outcomes. The data says it. There was immediate resistance by some school board members who represented areas of the city that did not have a large population of Latino men. And so this whole, wait, but we're taking resources away from the gifted and talented, we're taking resources away from our athletes to focus on Latino men, when in my opinion, those populations are doing just fine and have been served by the system for centuries. This idea of serving a population that doesn't resonate with your constituency or your personal experiences, and I in a board meeting had to push this board member and say, why is that a bad thing, focusing on Latino males? And I got a lot of backlash from the community, especially from her community. But I feel like until we get to a place where what is right where we relinquish this idea of, there's a fear that people have that if we focus on a certain population, then I will feel out of the picture, I will feel forgotten, and people need to be comfortable with that idea. It is, I mean, I could have coffee chats with people over this. I think some people know where I'm going, but it's, to your point, it's a very difficult conversation to have, because you cannot talk about schools, about equity, if you're not talking about race. That's my personal experience, and race is a very difficult conversation to have. But that's an example of all students, and then when you talk about a certain population that needs to be served, it's like, wait, not those students.
And it becomes ideological battle.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm not.
I love that we got into it. That was great.
I don't want to add another layer to this, but it's just a different kind of comment, which is in education, one of the things that happens is we put more money towards failing schools or failing operations. And in other industries, we don't. When something's failing, we don't dump more money into the worst retail store. And so I'm not saying that there's an answer there, but what I'm saying is how we think about operations in other industries is just bipolar to the way we think about fixing the system in education. It's not about like diverse schools, but really like the lowest performing schools, right? And so like when we think about like turnaround schools, I mean, these are like schools that have unstable leadership, unstable staff, consistently low performing, and the way we solve those problems is by throwing more money into it, and I'm not sure that's the right way.
Oh, I think we totally opened a can of worms here. I'll tell you what, we're gonna, what was that?
I just said.
I thought you were giving us a time check.
Oh, no. But I got my question.
All right, you got it in, yeah.
To me, and I don't want to sound overly simplistic here, because there's so many complicated issues, but I don't hear you talking about leadership. Great schools, great leaders.
Okay, we're gonna segue now, sorry. We're gonna segue, here's why. Because the point we want to get to, well, first of all, to answer your question and then segue is, there are only so many great leaders. And so if the answer is that we have to replace 5 million teachers, that's not gonna work. If the answer is we have to replace 130,000 principals, that's not gonna work. There just aren't enough.
There aren't enough.
You can't develop them, you have to replace them.
This is thank you for the transition.
Yes.
So that was a depressing question. We're going to get to a little more happy one now, but it relates. So here's the thing: purpose is not enough. We have to change our structures and processes. But one of as we were talking ahead of this, points that Anthony made, I just thought was a critical point of this is when we think about introducing a new process or a new structure, or a lot of times we think about that like almost in a robotic way, where there's a thing going on wrong, well, let's do the thing, and that'll fix the thing that went wrong. But the real reason the real benefit of instituting a process, a protocol, a structure, is to change mindsets, because that is what will happen when you create a process. When you create a cadence, it shifts a mindset. And at the end of the day, if you wouldn't need any process if everybody shared their mindsets and purpose, and of course we wouldn't want that because that would be a very static organization. But and we'll have a call out on this as well. every single process in your organization that has any routine to it, every metric, every structure reinforces a mindset, one or the other, good or bad. In our case, for example, having certain metrics that we're holding schools accountable may actually reinforce mindsets that actually hurt equity, they don't help equity. And if we don't look at the process through the lens of what mindsets they reinforce, then we're missing a lot. Then we're just adding process for process' sake.
Yeah. So I like how you
I just like turning it out.
So one of the things that often comes up is meeting time, right? We all sit in a bunch of meetings, and I've sat in a ton of school meetings, and one of the typical things that happens in a meeting is they all go over. And there's one meeting I went to not too far away from here in Connecticut, and they had about 30 administrators in the meeting, and these 30 administrators meet every week. I asked all of them if they knew why they were meeting, and none of them knew. But they did it for 3 hours. And so I said, well, let's count the hours that this represents, the person hours that this represents, and it was a boatload of hours, and these meetings go over and over again. And so what I was trying to explain to these folks is that that behavior actually has a ripple effect back to the schools, because those leaders aren't at the schools, and also they're late at the schools, and that also creates a customer experience issue with the students and parents that might need their attention because everything gets pushed back. And so we really have to create a behavior where we're respecting everyone's time.
So in all the times I've done talks on responsive organizations, oftentimes people ask for tactics. And what do I need to do? Just tell me what to do to be more responsive. And I think the answer is there's a lot you could do, but all of it should be aimed at changing those mindsets. So we were talking before about even just the term "safe to try" that a lot of organizations have adopted. That should we do it? And people begin to adopt this simple thing, safe to try, or they do a full integrated decision making, which is a decision making sort of protocol that reinforces experimentation, that reinforces that everybody's voice matters. Or even, to your point, when you say, look, we're going to create a protocol for how we structure our meetings. It may seem robotic or something, but what actually you're communicating is this time matters, and there's something we want to accomplish out of this time. We're actually reinforcing that your time matters. It's not just you're here to call back out. It's reinforcing that mindset. But at every school, there's usually some time the teacher has for preparation, or sometimes to collaborate. But when that time isn't made valuable by having protocols around, let's evaluate data, let's look at our students together, let's figure out an intervention and test it and hold each other accountable, let's visit each other's classrooms, then it's less effective. But when you're doing that and you're every week meeting and go through the protocols and figure it out, you're reinforcing every student matters. I can have ideas for things to try them, and if they don't work, that's okay, and I can try the next thing. One other thing, and this is something we started, but we actually learned from one of the principals that works with us. So in a lot of our work that we all do, conflict is just a part of it. I mean, to have a company means you're going to have conflict. You're going to have to decide on lots of things. Some of that conflict comes just from working together. Some of that conflict comes because you're trying to bring together people of diverse viewpoints, and that means there's people who might communicate differently. And people think that the way to deal with that is just to avoid conflict. But really, the way to do it is to get used to conflict in a way that you can do with empathy. You can have conflict where you're curious, and in some schools, I should say, and we've adopted this in our company, we try to practice healthy conflict by having, in our case, weekly rituals, we'll call them, where we pick a type of thing like giving difficult feedback or commenting on something you heard that made you uncomfortable, and we literally practice these scenarios. And this actually comes from, I can't remember the name, a book by a principal that talks about wanting to do this or doing this in our school, because man, you deal with a lot of conflict in school between the parents and the students and each other and you, and without those practices, it just feels horrible and difficult, and it doesn't even matter what the protocols are unless it's something that you practice.
Yeah, the other thing I would add is, when we just go back to like companies versus schools and whatnot, we all talk about, we have a description of what we want students to be able to do. We want self-directed learners, kids with goals, active learners, active participation, all of this stuff. And honestly, like I have trouble getting that out of the adults, right? And the people that I work with. And so like, how do we get the people we work with to set goals for themselves? How do we make them self-directed? How do they become active in meetings? And unless these practices exist in your meetings in schools, it's not going to get transferred over to the kids. And so that, that's something for us to think about.
Okay, one last question I'm going to ask you to ask each other, which is, every one of you are in organizations that have protocols, practices, usually things that happen on a cadence, or weekly, whatever's, or monthlies, or quarterlies. What I want you to do, it could be the same person since you already have gotten to be good friends, is turn to each other and answer the question, what mindset is that reinforcing? Whatever, pick one or of those. And is that a mindset that's good for the organization? The question is, pick up a cadence, a thing that you guys do regularly in your company, and answer the question, what mindset does that activity reinforce, good or bad?
For example, like every Friday, our organization has a 30-minute all-hands meeting. And it's sitting dead, pretty much. But we think it serves a purpose. So like that creates a certain mindset of maybe like people wait for Friday to get information from us, and if we don't share that information, they don't go seek it out. Like that could be one of the things.
That's a good example. Like, yeah, a company that once a year does a giant performance review is going to reinforce certain mindsets leading up to it, and all, But it could be small. Your company quarterly does a business review where somebody like presents to the leadership. And, like, think about when you leave those, what mindsets are being reinforced in that, and is that a good or bad thing? Is that what is helping your organization or not? So you have to pick one, very quickly talk. You have 3 minutes, and then we're going to ask, and there might be prizes.
There might be a prize.